Thank you for coming today. My name is Charles Cadwell. I'm the director of the Center on International Development and Governance here at the Urban Institute. And it's my job to welcome you to this discussion of Pakistan's middle class. Lessons learned, we might say challenges at the end of our discussion, but in any event. Many of you may know the Urban Institute for our large domestic research programs, but in truth, since about the mid-1980s, the Urban Institute's had a program working in many, many other countries around the world, promoting both economic development and governance improvements. Doing that, we've had the privilege of working in many, many countries, including Pakistan, and the reason that's a privilege is because we get to work with really top-flight partners and institutions in those countries. And so today we're happy to co-sponsor this event with one such organization, the Consortium for Development Policy and Research in Lahore, Pakistan, CDPR. And I could tell you about that, but we're fortunate to have its chairman with us today, Mr. Ijaz Nabi, to help open today's discussion and participate. So Ijaz, if I could ask you to say a few words of welcome and a little bit about CDPR, that would be very helpful.
Thank you, Chaz. Thank you for making this happen. CDPR is actually located in Lahore, Pakistan. It's a consortium of 3 research centers. It's an informal consortium. Each of these research centers has an independent board. They have their own sources of funding. They have their own research programs. But we come together for dissemination purposes on one platform. And that platform is called the Consortium for Development Policy Research, or CDPR. The 3 research centers are, one is the IGC, International Growth Center, which is in turn a consortium of London School of Economics and Oxford University. It's funded by DFID UK. And then they have programs in 15 countries. Pakistan is one of those. And I had the IGC program in Pakistan. IGC has a whole portfolio of research activities in Pakistan covering state capability, private sector development, cities, and energy. Then we have IDEAS, which is the Institute for Development Economics and Alternatives. It was started with support from Soros Foundation, but now they're increasingly raising their own resources from within the country and elsewhere. And they have a very rich program of research in human development, in political economy, in inclusion, etc. And then we have the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan. This is led by some high-flying Pakistani professors at Howard, at Princeton, and at Pomona College. They have an independent board, and they also have a very rich policy agenda. Now, in addition to the policy programs, most of us who are involved with these research centers, we also carry out many policy activities, assignments for the government, in the sense of being on policy advisory committees, or being on the board of Section 42 companies, which is a way for the government to augment its capacity without changing the fundamental rules by which people are hired and fired in the government. So because of all that, people engaged in these 3 centers have access to both policy making as well as policy research. And therefore, CDPR has a very rich program of events of disseminating the work that gets done at these 3 centers. Now, it so happened that a number of CDPR fellows are actually in Washington. So Shariar over there suggested that why don't we host an event in Washington, and that's when Chaz and Rihanna came in. They said, oh, we'd share the space with you at the Urban Institute. And that's how, despite being physically thousands of miles away, we are in a position to offer the views on a topic which is becoming increasingly important in Pakistan. We will hear much more formal exposition of the empirics behind the assertion that Pakistan has a large and growing middle class. But this assertion is very strong, this belief is very strong, and there's a huge amount of anecdotal evidence that that may well be happening. When you visit Pakistan, you see the manifestation of this, the consumption patterns associated with the middle class, whether it's in the housing market or it's in the financial markets. And you got $30 billion, up to $30 billion of remittances coming in, 20 billion through the banking system, 10 billion informally. So there's a large volume of money that's creating the stir and creating the middle class that have been talked about. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, there was an opinion column in the New York Times talking about the middle class and what that means for the country. So the topic suggested itself, and we had a number of honorary non-resident fellows of CDPR in Washington, starting with Homi Kharas, who's done a lot of work in this area on the global middle class, Ghazala Mansouri, who knows the data of Pakistan inside out. So you can't find a better person than Ghazala to talk about it. And Rihanna, who's a founding member of CDPR, will be talking about other dimensions of it. So the opportunity was there, the people were there, and I'm glad to see that the audience is there. So we can...
Thank you very much, Ijaz. I should remind people here in the room that this event is being live streamed. For those of you online, we encourage you to contribute to the dialogue by sharing your thoughts on social media, using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban, all one word. And you have the speakers' Twitter handles on your screen, I guess, so you can copy them as well. The virtual audience will also get to join our discussion by asking questions when the time comes. So if you're tuning in, you can email your questions to events@urban.org, and they will find their way to me when we get to that part of the program. Having said that, I want to take a minute and just remind us why are we worrying about the middle class. And Nancy Birdsell, our neighbor of the Center for Global Development, summed up this in a 2016 essay that I like. She says, after all, history suggests that a large and secure middle class is a solid foundation on which to build and sustain an effective democratic state. Middle classes not only have the wherewithal to finance vital services such as roads, public education through their taxes, they also demand regulations, the fair enforcement of contracts, the rule of law more generally, public goods that create a level social and economic playing field on which all can prosper. That sounds great. If Nancy's correct, even while so much international development focuses on poverty, should we be thinking about the transition to the middle class? And of course, as we will soon hear, nothing is as virtuous as the circle I've just described. Prosperity supporting well-governed model of state behavior that underlies so much of our work and development gets upset by the fact that the averages and the aggregates obscure a whole lot of detailed dynamism and other activity going underneath those national level statistics. So we do have 4 experts this afternoon. 3 of them here, 1 will join us by videotape. And so we're going to start with Homi Kharas, who is at the Brookings Institution. And you have bios of the speakers on your chairs, so I won't go through the whole bio. But he will talk to us, show us some slides, and then I'll turn to Ghazala Mansouri to talk about her work on transitions out of poverty. Ghazala is at the World Bank, and where she is the lead economist in the Poverty Reduction and Equity Group. And then finally here, Rihanna Raza is a colleague here at the Urban Institute, but has the World Bank in her background as well. But one of the reasons we're so happy she agreed to join us here at the Urban Institute was indeed her founding of the Center for Development Policy and Research. And finally, we'll have a video recording from Dr. Ali Chima, who's 10 time zones away. His work in Pakistan at the Institute for Development and Economic Alternatives and many other hats he wears is wide-ranging, and he will talk to us about what he and his team are learning about political participation in the middle class. With that, let us start. And Homi, can you please set the scene for us and tell us what's happening with the middle class globally and in Pakistan?
Clicker. I was going to use a timer, but it's not working, so this way I get some extra
You
time.
have me.
So, thank you. So my job is basically to try to lay out a little bit of the numbers behind the middle class, and I wanted to start by actually saying that as we come into looking at these kinds of questions and issues, the numbers become very difficult and problematic. So we're really working off trends and hunches and assumptions, and but I think, as Ijaz was saying, there's plenty of anecdotal evidence to say that there is the beginnings of a story that is coming here. But one reason why I want to emphasize that right up front is because if you leap from that to sort of, conclusions like Nancy's, I think it's a big leap. So, these kinds of discussions about the middle class, I think, are discussions about something which we're only really beginning to understand, and which are actually look quite different in different places. So just bear with me on that for a little bit. So do I click? Do I? Not much happens. It's upside down. That would. Thank you. So let's just start with Pakistan. There are really just a couple of things to notice about Pakistan. It's an economy which is now coming up to 300 billion, so it's not an insignificant sized economy. And it's got 200 million people, so it is a large, populous country. It's growing right now at about 4.5%, which is population growth is just under 2%, so that's about 2.5%. IMF projections are that this will go to about 6%, so you might be looking at per capita growth rates of 3 to 4% per year. With those kinds of growth rates, when you push it out 10 years or 15 years or something like that, you actually tend to get quite remarkable structural transformations. So what I'm going to talk about is you might question issues on levels, but hopefully you will be more persuaded by issues on these are the trends going forward. Because the levels we can always debate what's the exact starting point or whatever. I think we probably have a little bit more faith in things going forward. And the few macro statistics there are simply designed to show you that there is perhaps no immediate pressing macro problem that should derail growth in the short run. So let's start by trying to say, what are we talking about when we talk about the middle class? Every country has its own definition of the middle class. If you're trying to do cross-country comparisons, that makes it very hard to work with. So in the work that I've been doing, I simply impose a uniform definition of the middle class. And being an economist, I use an economics definition of the middle class, even though the middle class is, by definition, not an economic concept. It's more of a sociological concept. That said, in economics, the middle class does have some properties. People who are in the middle class tend to be able to afford certain non-essential items. They go on holiday, they eat out, they go to the movies, there's some entertainment value. They're actually making choices about what they consume. People who are very poor tend to make no choices. They live and they survive. People who are very rich make no choices because there are no real trade-offs. They can just have anything that they want. In between those two is a group which actually has to make choices, and for economists, usually they make those choices based on budget constraints and prices. So those are the sorts of things that economists worry about. Those are the sorts of things that people in the middle class worry about. There are a whole bunch of reasons as to why one takes this range. going back to historical reasons about what did the middle class look like in, say, Victorian Britain, but also going through to a bunch of marketing studies when you start to ask people at what kinds of income levels do people start to buy consumer durables or other things which are reflective of what we would think of as a middle class lifestyle. So essentially we started, it was nice round numbers, it was 10 to 100 in 2005 PPP terms, then of course the PPP exercise got updated, so we've had to update the range, now it's 11 to 110. So that's just to say it's useful to have a common definition across the world, especially if you're trying to look at the size of a middle class in any particular country compared to others. So the key slide is illegible. And my apologies for that. So let me read off some numbers. The first big kind of column towards the left of the slide is 2015, and all the way to the right is 2030. And what the slide says is that if you use a methodology, which I'll explain in a second, Pakistan probably has about 50 million people in the middle class today. That's 27% of the population. And it would be ranked 15th in the world in terms of the sheer numbers of people in the middle class. And that's largely due to the fact that at 200 million people, Pakistan is the 5th most populous country in the world. Fast forward to 2030. And instead of being a country with 27% of its population in the middle class, Pakistan looks as if it might be a country with 66% of its population in the middle class. In other words, 2/3. And 2/3 is what you'll find in, say, Latin America today in most countries. At that time, with population growth rates, etc., it'll have 160 million people in the middle class. And its rank will still be approximately the same. It'll be the 13th most populous middle class country in the world. The key point really is this transformation. You're going from just about a quarter of the population in the middle class to 2/3. That is a very dramatic change in the nature of society, and it has all kinds of implications. Now, how do we get these numbers? We get these numbers by using a combination of survey data and national accounts data. So usually what happens with survey data is we have a household survey, people go around, they ask people how much do you spend, how much do you earn, they make some computations. From those computations we can actually estimate a distribution for Pakistan as a whole. Once you've estimated that distribution, you can then take the thresholds that we've identified and figure out this is how many people live between these thresholds. That's all fine. The problem that we have in Pakistan is that when you take the survey data and you say this is how much total consumption there is, and then you take the national accounts data and that says this is how much personal consumption there is a gap. I'm going to show you the gap. The gap is about 60%, so it's not trivial. We're actually missing more than half. So the big question and the big assumption is, what do you do with this missing stuff? The top line is national accounts. The lower line is the survey. Totals. This is just total aggregate, so there's no distribution anything in here. If you're looking just at poverty, the poverty people say, all of this stuff must be rich people, so we can ignore it. Maybe. When you go down to the details, you find that a lot of these missing elements are in services sectors, which have grown very rapidly. And bluntly, my own view is that they rarely update these questionnaires and the surveys. So they're still asking questions from the times before mobile phones were invented, and meanwhile everybody's happily moved off into consuming quite different types of goods, and it doesn't show up on the survey for the very simple reason that there isn't a question about that in the survey other than a general question which says, did we miss anything? So who's going to say, yes, you missed this and that? So there's a real question about how you allocate. And some people say it should all go to the top. Some people should say that it should be evenly allocated. We have just taken the assumption that we allocate it in proportion to what is actually being said. So if somebody says, I spent 10, we say that probably means you spent 16, because we've got to account for an extra 60%, and so on and so forth. That's what you need to do in order to get some of these numbers. Then you can use the projections of the national accounts to give you these forecasts for how the surveys will go. And just to show you the difference, again, I'm sorry, you can't actually see this, but if you believe the survey data, then you basically say you think that Pakistan is poorer than Kenya or Cameroon or places in Africa. If you believe the national income accounts, Pakistan is somewhat richer than those countries. So in some sense, you have to make judgments about your view on these things. If you look just at surveys, Pakistan and Bangladesh look very close to each other. If you look at national income accounts, Pakistan is somewhat richer than Bangladesh. So, you know, for some people, making these sort of pairwise comparisons is a way of forming their judgments about these things. Now, what difference does it, well, I'm going the wrong way. What difference does it make? So, one obvious difference is climate change. More middle class, more consumption. More consumption, more carbon emissions. If this is happening in Pakistan, it's also happening everywhere else in the world. Can the world really afford, when you add it all up together, these kinds of growth rates? And there, I think what we've found is that there is a bit of a trade-off, because the middle class tends to be much more urbanized and it tends to be much better educated. That's actually how people get into the middle class. People in urban areas at the same level of income have lower carbon footprints. People who are better educated have lower carbon footprints, partly because they have smaller household sizes. So there are just fewer people. So if you push these demographics out far enough, what you see is that there is a tremendous interaction between the size of the middle class and fertility rates and your overall population. So if we're right in thinking that Pakistan will become a predominantly middle class country, then most likely I would say the slowdown in population growth rate in Pakistan will accelerate. And some of the projections for Pakistan's population growth that the UN make will not come to pass. They'll be too high, because in the UN projections, they do not have any kind of modeling about the middle class, what's going to happen to girls' education, and hence what's going to happen to fertility rates and the like. Second, massive emphasis, I think, on education. One of the things that the middle class wants more than anything else is better livelihoods for their families. And that is essentially all about education. It's about some other services. It's about public transport. It's about low-cost housing. And you see lots of these in countries which today already have large middle-class populations. And when you see discontent in those countries, it's often about the public delivery of those services. When we looked at the Arab Spring, for example, with places like Egypt are big middle-class populations. They're certainly not poor populations. Massive discontent with public transport, with the way in which subsidies were being delivered and things like that. And then finally, and I'm going to end here, there are these issues about democracy. So does a bigger middle class lead to more stable democratic institutions and things like that? All of the empirical evidence says no. There is not a jot of empirical evidence that says, there are plenty of examples that you can find that show that in democratic societies you also have high middle classes, but there are also plenty of cases where you have lots of autocratic societies with large middle classes, and when you actually parse it all out, you don't find any empirical relationship between the two. You find a real tension in the middle class, which is that they tend to demand, as I said, lots of services from the government. When it comes to actually paying taxes to finance those services, they uniformly say no. When it comes to public goods, things like environment and spending that, and you say, we're going to tax you in order to finance that, no. So all of the public opinion polls on middle class preferences, etc., are all for stability, for low taxes, but at the same time for services. And actually what tends to happen over time is that the middle class co-opts a lot of the what were formerly pro-poor programs and services. And they start to get reoriented away from the old social compact, which was rich people pay some taxes and there's a transfer basically to poor people, to a new social compact, which is all of that money basically gets put back into middle class programs, which are pensions, universities, housing, public transport, urban development in many cases, and not really the issues that the most marginalized segments of the population really care about. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very, very much. Zali, you've been looking at rural poverty in particular, but is Homi right that it's urbanization and education is the mechanism of transition, or?
Yeah. So I'm actually going to start by asking, what do we mean by the middle class? I mean, we seem to all have settled on some notion of this group called the middle class. And if I look at theoretically, then there were conceptions of this so-called middle group in theory. In a materialist sense, they would be called the petty bourgeoisie for a long time, right? They were not necessarily seen as agents of change in society. Or if you look at sort of in a Weberian sense, then these are people who have better life chances than everybody else, right? But again, not necessarily seen as fundamental agents of change. But I think what we can agree on is that, however we look at them, this is a group that has escaped sort of the worst deprivations of poverty, right? And Homi said they have like choices to make now, right? I would argue that even the poor have to make choices. Sometimes the choices are just awful, right? But let's say that the middle class have better choices to make, right? They are a group that therefore leans, as Homi said again, I think exactly correctly, leans very heavily on the state. So they are not rich enough to opt out of public service delivery. The very wealthy often opt out. They can go to private hospitals, they can send their children to private schools, they may even send them abroad, right? The middle class solidly needs the state, right? It is extremely reliant on the state. So it needs better service delivery. So often we say, okay, when there's a large middle class, they have a big demand, whether that's through lobbying, through participation in electoral politics, however, but they demand better services from the state. Does that lead to better services for all? Is again questionable, right? Because it might well do that. I mean, maybe better transportation gets down to even poorer people, but it does not. I think this is an empirical question, right? So essentially, yeah. Then there is this idea that somehow they are also people who have escaped the traditional hierarchies of rural societies, right? So they tend to be more modern, right? They may be more development oriented, perhaps even more secular in certain sense. So they're sort of the harbingers of social change in society. So we need to maximize them in some sense, right? The bigger the middle class, the better our chances of growing as a modern, development oriented, good policy, public good society. And I think Homi already problematized that, I think, very nicely. It is not evident at all, in fact, that as the middle class grows, that their politics is necessarily more inclusive, right? It's just not, it's not clear at all. I think we need more evidence on that, if anything, but the data does not suggest it, right? So how do people actually try to, but in any case, I mean, to get a handle around all of these things, you need to somehow try to define this group in data, right? Then there are many approaches to this, right? But almost all of them rely on placing that somewhere in the distribution of income. That's sort of the key metric, right? Now, some people try to also look at them as a group that already has some characteristics, which we've assumed, and I think correctly, that they will have, which actually people in the middle of the income distribution tend to have, right? Which is that they're investing more in education, they want white-collar jobs, they have certain lifestyle choices that they make, better housing, more durable goods. So you can locate them in either way. But nonetheless, you're relying very heavily on a notion of income, right, to locate them. So people do many, many exercises on this. And if I could show you slides, you'd see that literally you can change the definition slightly, and the middle class grows from 20% to 80%, right? And the definitions all over the place. Somehow they're all hinged somewhere on the median income. So the idea is somehow let's pick a group that's securely above poverty, above the risk of falling into poverty also, not just above poverty, but above the risk of falling into poverty. And that can vary a great deal. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Pakistan's data and what it shows. Okay? So I agree that the data is problematic, particularly in two ways that are important for defining the middle class. One is that in the main survey, the Household Income and Expenditure Survey for Pakistan, there appears to be quite a bit of drop truncation, by which we mean it looks like several percentage of people right at the top of the distribution are missing. Pakistan is not unique in this regard. Virtually every country has this problem. People at the top end of the distribution don't open their doors to answer surveys, and surveyors are constantly struggling with how to include this group, right? So if you look, we call them non-sampling errors, basically, right? They emerge in the field. You go and try to interview these households. They don't answer surveys. So how much is that? I think we've just started scratching the surface on trying to understand this, but I'm going to throw out a number that I cannot back, right? Which is that it could be as much as 8 to 10%. Okay, so you may be missing, in the worst case scenario, the top decile. Why do I say this? When we look at the top expenditure group, it's just extraordinarily small, right? So clearly we are missing people at the top, right? The problem is that the GDP data is equally problematic, right? And we've only just started working with the government on sort of reviewing what's going on with national accounts. But this consumption that's coming is really just a residual, right? They have some algorithms by which they determine what's happening in production. They're missing a good chunk of production, as it turns out. Particularly production in the informal sector is being almost entirely missed. Pakistan does not have a comprehensive census of household enterprises that has been updated since maybe 2001 or 2, I forget the exact year. So when the entire informal service sector, which is what has grown the most, one could argue in the last 16 years, is missing, it is impossible to know what exactly the GDP numbers are showing. Our sense, though, is that if anything, GDP is probably being underestimated. Okay? So if that's the case, then perhaps between the missing 10% at the top and the underestimation of the GDP, maybe these calculations are correct, right? It's just hard for me to say anything about it at this point because the data is problematic on both levels. That does not, however, mean that the data is bad. People draw this conclusion a lot in Pakistan, right? It's like, oh, the data's crap, right? But the data is not crap. It's not bad. It's just that it suffers from certain understandable shortcomings, right? So the data for almost all developing countries is drop truncated. I know people who are working on this issue in Indonesia right now, right? And they already find drop truncation around the same levels as Pakistan, right? But nobody's saying that the Indonesia data is bad, right? So with this caveat in mind, I want to tell you what the data is showing, right? And we can, as we said, debate the numbers, right? So if I,
a couple minutes.
Yeah, I'm going to be very quick. And I'm going to come to the point, right? So essentially, using the data for Pakistan, you can't find more than 5% of people who would fall in the $10 or $11 a day range today, right? The bulk, basically the top 3 deciles, if you take from the 7th to the 9th decile, you see incomes at the level of $5 and $5 in purchasing power parity terms, to $8 a day. That's where the wealthiest sit, excluding the top decile, right? If you include them, then people with anything much more than this are maybe 4%, right? Let's say the top 10% is missing, let's add them in, right? And that's very generous, right? Top 10, you still get about 15%. That would constitute people at $10 a day or more, right? So I think it's still a very small number. But more importantly, I think, so I mean, that's, and then we can add in all the GDP issues. But without worrying about the numbers, we say, okay, what I did was I took data from 2001 to 2017 to try to understand, okay, let's fix some income level in 2001. Folks we think constituted the middle class in 2001. If we fix that income level, we can look at a couple of things. We can look at who is earning that income level today, right? That's one, right? Which groups? So you look at overall growth of income within this group. You can look at who's earning that income level today. And then you can look at whether their characteristics are changing. Are they starting to look more like the top 3 deciles as their income grows, right? And those things show some interesting patterns. So in the folks who constitute the 7th to 9th decile, there's been a tremendous growth of income. As I said, they went from 3 to 5 to like $5 to $8, $9 a day per person per day, right? At the same time, their educational attainment more than doubled. And I'm talking now about at least one person in the household with a college degree, right? Matriculation rates for secondary school more than doubled. Far more people aspiring to white-collar jobs, all the usual stuff we expect to see. Families down by one child, right? So a whole child less in terms of the number of children per household. But the interesting thing is that the folks who start earning the same income as them are now in the 3rd to the 6th decile, right? And so we looked at what point they start looking more like the 7th to the 9th decile, right? And that catches up pretty quickly, right? So now they are basically people in the 3rd to the 6th decile. You see a lot more white-collar job aspirants, right? A lot more higher college women with higher women going to college. At least one woman in the household going to college, and so forth. So what's the point of all this? Obviously, Pakistan has seen a lot of income growth, right? And not only is it true that what's interesting to me is that it seems at the end of the day, I was just trying to verify this for myself, that at the end of the day, income does drive change, right? So it's income that is driving all these other characteristics, right? Income grows and then people start, because this is investment in children's education, right, that we are seeing. So that's true. But what we forget about Pakistan is that 50% of Pakistanis are still sitting in rural areas, right? So in fact, they saw the same income growth. In fact, they saw faster income growth, the rural areas, than urban areas, but growth, not level, right? So they start from a lower level, but they see faster growth. But they don't see these changes as much. So there is something very particular in the link between income and these characteristics that has been mediated by being urban, right? This is also, by the way, I'm taking one more minute, is also being validated in some work we've done looking at panel data over a very long period of time that actually shows that in particular areas that had land ownership inequality, that it was much harder to escape chronic poverty, and the two main channels seem to be very little educational mobility, and also again equally little occupational mobility, right? So basically we look at father-son cohorts over time to look at this, and rural areas just seem to be stuck. And particularly where there's lots of land inequality, like in Sindh, southern Punjab, these areas are really just not moving, right? And you can see that in the aggregate data as well. Even as income changes are showing, right, you don't see the same kind of mobility at all. So that will lead us into some policy questions that I'll hold off on, and we can talk more.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I've got lots of questions about the policy questions of how we make that next jump. Rihanna, you've been looking at education and whether that's actually a facilitator that we hope it is, particularly for girls and women. Spend a few minutes on that if you would.
So unlike Ghazala and Humi, I haven't really played around with that much data. I did download the PSLM and played around with certain categories to look at this issue of women's education in particular. And so I'm coming to this as looking at women, women's education, particularly women in higher education or post-secondary education, and looking at, so I would call this group middle, and taking Ghazali's could be upper middle class women, and looking at what's happening to them, looking at if urbanization, declining poverty, increasing disposable income in households, what does it really mean for women's education, women's labor force participation, for empowerment and changing norms in broader society. So, I mean, most of us who look at Pakistan and education, the story is quite dire, and Pakistan doesn't really stand out too well. But the story is quite different when you start looking at secondary and tertiary education. There's some interesting things happening there. And I would say it's a middle and upper middle class phenomena. So, Pakistan's sort of primary enrollment rates have been stagnant, particularly for girls, for the past five years or so. Pakistan didn't meet its Millennium Development Goal on education. And Pakistan, I think, is after Nigeria, is the second most out-of-school children in the world, and most of them are girls. 2/3 of them are girls, as you would expect. But actually, when you start looking at enrollment at the secondary level, and you start looking at enrollment at the tertiary level, that seems to be changing. Gross enrollment rates and net enrollment rates at the secondary level have sort of grown by 10% in the past decade in Pakistan for girls. At the tertiary level as well in the past decade, from 2005 to 2015, 2016, you see that girls' enrollment has gone from 200,000 to 600,000. Now, that's not a huge number given Pakistan's population, but the trend is upwards and seems to suggest that there's an increasing number of women who are entering higher education. When you look at education, when you look at educational attainment by household, I looked at $4 per day to $10 and above $10. You see that educational attainment is at the level that Homi is talking about for people more than $10, very small percentage according to Ghazala. About 85% of those women finish metric or 10 years of schooling. And then it goes up, 24% or so on the PSLM data for 2015, 2016 have bachelor's degrees, and then about 17, 18% have graduate degrees. So and when you look at the income group below that, you also see similar patterns, but those patterns are stark, obviously, in urban areas, and not so stark in rural areas. So that's what seems to be. So, there is, women, in terms of attainment, women clearly lag behind in decades behind men, but are catching up. If you were a young woman in a household that was $10 per day in current PPP terms, you would find 20% of that cohort would reach higher education if you were born in 1980. So the improvements. What's interesting, I think, is that improvements in educational attainment for women are not necessarily translating into women's participation in the labor market. And that seems to be the case. Labor market participation in South Asia is overall pretty poor, and Pakistan's trend is upwards, coming from a very low base. But only 25% of women in the labor force actually are actually active in the labor market. And actually, if you look at the cohort of women who are completing higher education or who have a bachelor's degree, only 1 in 5 of them actually enter the labor market. That number jumps up quite significantly if you have a graduate degree. So one in 3, I think it's 40% of them enter the labor market. But generally, that's the pattern that you're seeing, and that's an interesting question to ask. The evidence on economic returns also seems to suggest that returns for girls are also quite high, whereas men are able to sort of find occupations and employment at every level of education. So if you finish primary or secondary or whatever employment, you enter the labor market. For women, women sort of enter the labor market in much greater numbers after finishing 10 years of schooling or more. And in terms of economic rates of return, in terms of sort of incremental earnings for every additional year of schooling, you again see that women, the returns are much higher for women vis-a-vis men. So there is an opportunity in terms of sort of narrowing gender income gaps in Pakistan. But interestingly, we don't seem to see that happening. So that's where I'm just going to, I'm saying much less than the others.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I want to keep going so we have time for your comments and questions. We're going to turn to the video contribution from Ali Chima. For those of you online, there should be a button in the bottom middle of your screen you can push to watch this video with us.
Let me begin by thanking the Urban Institute for asking me to send in this video and for inviting me to participate on this important panel. What I want to do in the next 5 to 7 minutes is to draw out the implications of rising urbanization and a growing middle class for gender in politics in Pakistan. The literature on the middle class suggests that the growth of the middle class is associated with urbanization. The evidence in Pakistan shows that the growth of the middle class is indeed an urban phenomena. Middle class households in Pakistan tend to be urbanized, they have better education and higher incomes. We also find in the Pakistani case the rising urbanization is associated with a reduction in the gender gap in educational attainment. The interesting political economy question is whether rising urbanization and a growing middle class are also associated with a reduction in the gender gap in political participation. I have begun work on this question with colleagues from Columbia and Harvard and the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex. And our initial findings suggest that this isn't the case. Contrary to expectations that the gender gap in political participation would fall with urbanization, we find that in fact male-female differences in voter registration worsen with urbanization. That is to say that the expansion in political rights for women in urban areas does not happen at the same rate as men. We also find that male-female differences in turnout don't fall with urbanization, and that in these contexts they remain at double-digit levels, which is very high by international standards. So it seems Pakistan's urban transformation, which is reducing gender gaps in educational attainment, isn't really resulting in a similar reduction in gender gaps in political participation. So what's the rigidity here? And the standard explanation that you hear in the media narrative around Pakistan is that this is due to the persistence of patriarchal norms, which either explicitly prohibit women from voting or exercising their right to vote, or even if they don't do that, they certainly prohibit women from voting as autonomous voters. An idea there is that kind of norms underpin collective decision-making within families, which is dominated by male members, and as a result, women end up becoming proxy voters for male members of their family and are discounted by the political system. Our work, which is focused on large cities, and particularly our work on the mega city of Lahore, which has a population of 11.1 million, actually doesn't find evidence that supports these two stories. So ethnographic work that we've done in Lahore over the past 4 to 5 months actually shows we couldn't really find prohibitive norms being very strong in this context. And we didn't find lots of instances where women were actually prohibited either by their community or by their families in terms of exercising their right to vote. Our analysis of electoral returns data from Lahore actually finds women acting as autonomous voters. So the nice thing about Lahore is that nearly 90% of its polling stations are gender segregated. So at the neighborhood level, this allows you to observe the differences or similarities in male and female voting patterns in elections. And what we find is that within neighborhoods, it's not necessarily correct that women vote or vote for the same parties as male voters in their neighborhoods. In fact, we find divergences which at times can have important consequences for electoral races that are determined by women. But despite the fact that you have permissible norms for voting, and despite the fact that women who do end up going and voting are voting in a different way from male voters in the same neighborhood, we actually find that Lahore has fairly high levels of gender gaps in voter registration and voter turnout. So then the question is that what's the constraint in an area like Lahore that is resulting in a persistence in the gender gap in political participation? And the story that we're leaning towards is that the explanation has to be found in the patriarchal nature of political party organizations at the local level. Political party organizations are manned by political workers who are important conduits of engagement between voters and parties, and they are the main mechanisms that are used to mobilize voters around elections. What we find is that political worker networks are dominated by males. And what that does is that it results in a disengagement between women voters and local organizations of political parties. And that has a number of adverse consequences for democratic engagement. Firstly, the campaigns that parties end up designing respond largely to the preferences of men and become far less appealing for women because they're not addressing the issues that women are grappling with. In our focus groups and in our ethnographic work and in a political attitude survey that we did earlier this year, we found repeatedly that women feel that they're invisible members of the kind of electoral arena in Pakistan, and parties just simply don't recognize them as voters. The second implication that it has is that parties, when they're designing their get out the vote strategies, are not addressing the constraints that disable women from going and exercising their choice to vote. So they're not enablers. They don't become enablers in the same way that they are enabling organizations for male voters. So it's not surprising that in our political attitude survey, women respondents were 21% more likely than their male counterparts to agree or strongly agree with the statement that political parties are only interested in people's votes and not in their needs. So this suggests that despite the fact that we have a phenomena of a rising urbanization, and in those contexts there is a growing middle class, that is not resulting in gender inclusion in the political process, and that doesn't really bode well for democracy in Pakistan. So what's the big takeaway here? The big takeaway for this panel is that we can't see urbanization and a growing middle class as a teleological process. And we really need to understand structural constraints that may continue to impede inclusion and equitable outcomes, even in arenas where middle class growth is happening. Thank you.
Well, if Ali were here with us, I would have many, many questions for him. But Ijaz, maybe you could start off our discussion, and then we'll shortly open it up to the audience. So.
I'm not going to even attempt to sum this up because, you know, we covered so many different topics. But Ghazala's work on poverty in Pakistan shows a dramatic decline in poverty, right, in the last 3 decades. A truly dramatic decline in poverty, and high correlates with improved asset ownership, even among the rural households. So there is even though we don't know at the upper end what's going on, there is a big change taking place. There's no question about that. And Homi makes the assumption that all good former World Bank economists do. We can make the projections based on credible assumptions, and we can come up with the results, which are very impressive in this case, which is that the size of the middle class will be what Homi predicts it to be. Just like Ali raised an important question. Are there structural constraints in the society which prevent Pakistan from benefiting from some of the gains that will happen from the increase in the size of the middle class, which is, will we have more women voters? And the answer to that seems to be that unless we address those structural constraints, we cannot expect to have those benefits of a much larger middle class. My question to the economists on the panel is, if you look at the structure of Pakistan's economy, manufacturing is stagnant. Exports in the last 10 years beginning to decline. Now, Homi and I worked on East Asia several years ago, and we know the transformation of some of the economies there that happened as a result of jobs that were created in the manufacturing sector and jobs that were created, especially in manufactured exports. Now, if that's not happening in Pakistan, how will this 6.5 to 7% growth that's needed for the middle class to become the size that is projected to become in 2030, how will this happen? And are there things that are going to impede the realization of these impressive numbers on which the policymakers need to engage themselves? So let me just stop there.
That's a really simple question. I'm sure we can get a one-sentence answer from people. Anybody want to take it?
I'll give you a one-word answer, and that is services. When you look at the transformation that's happening in economies like Pakistan, the dynamism is in the services sector. When you look at the way in which, education is happening, the jobs that people are going into, it's all in the services sector. And then the big question becomes, is that enough? Is it good enough? Do you have the kind of productivity growth? And this is where, there's a lot of discussion amongst many of us. And obviously the thing that has saved Pakistan in some sense is that you may not have manufactured exports, but if you have people exports, you get $30 billion of remittances. That's a lot of manufacturing goods that it is substituting for. So in some sense, as long as there's enough of that kind of buffer in the economy, it does allow the services sector to grow and flourish. And the kinds of things that the middle class demands are things that are very labor intensive. So if you demand education services, for example, if there's going to be this big increase in the expansion of education, let's say secondary education and things like that, you get a big expansion in teachers. If you're going to have health clinics across the country, you're going to have a big expansion, not so much of doctors, but certainly of nurses and other kinds of healthcare professionals. In terms of absolute numbers, these can be quite big. So, when I think of the kinds of jobs, you have your standard jobs in construction and retail. And then you have these new emerging services. Then you have, of course, all of the, mobile and the mobile banking and other kinds of services, etc. So that's where I think the jobs will be created. And the idea now of developing countries relying heavily on labor-intensive manufacturing, I think it's an episode which is passing, and maybe that'll turn out to be a good thing. Maybe it'll turn out to be a bad thing. I think it's just too early for us to tell, because we haven't really seen the way in which this new world of services is really going to emerge. But the reason why urbanization is so important is because one way or another, most of these kinds of jobs will happen in urban areas. And whether it's services or whether it is labor-intensive manufacturing, you can only do that efficiently with the agglomeration economies that you get in urban areas. And so having urban areas that are functional, where you can get around, where you have transport access, is really critical. We probably do not have that right now. Certainly in places like Karachi, it's difficult to argue that this is a city which is functioning at its full potential.
I'm mindful of our hour, and I want to make sure I've guaranteed some time for our audience. I have a jillion other questions I would ask dealing with people's, particularly given the emphasis on state-provided services, people's confidence in the legitimacy of the state and the fairness of the state. It's a much more amorphous outcome, but research on fragile, failed states emphasizes that this, autocracy may be able to perform for a period, but this legitimacy that comes with other forms of government may be an important long-term asset that we have to ask about in Pakistan. But I'm going to ask questions from the audience. There's microphones, and if you could introduce yourself when you get the microphone. And let's start on this side. Where was the hand? Right there. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Zahid Bukhari. I'm with the ICNA Council for Social Justice.
Could you hold the microphone a little closer?
First of all, I think let me congratulate Urban Institute and the Consortium that in Washington, D.C. normally will listen only Pakistan negative thing. And this is a very positive, I think they took the lead. And that's wonderful. My very quick two questions. One is a couple of months ago in Wall Street Journal, there was a report that there are 4% rich and 38% middle class. And they took the variable of motorcycles and washing machine, that approximately their estimate was 42%, like 84 million. So what is your comment on that? And number two is all this claim of this huge reduction in poverty and increase in the middle class. Is Pakistan defying any model or Pakistan following the regular, normal model of development?
I'm going to collect a couple of questions over here. Harvey?
Harvey Galper here at the Urban Institute. I have a question with respect to the fields of study of women who go to college and then have postgraduate education. Are they in any ways aligned with where the demands might be as the economy develops for the types of services that Comey was just talking about? Or are they not related to that, whether they be for education or maybe science or health or computer technology or whatever, how those fields of study might line up with the new demands as the economy expands?
Thank you. And at the very back, I'll take one more, then we'll try to answer these.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Sahar. I'm from the Voice of America. Some American analysts believe that it's Pakistani middle class that is more prone to joining terror networks. Is this true? Terrorism networks. Is this true? If not, we have some examples of this.
Let's try those to maybe start with.
I think Homi will answer that question.
Homi, on the first couple of questions on the definition.
Because these definitions are so amorphous, I think it is useful to try to collect lots of different data points. And so, whether it's motorcycles or cars or consumer durables or, these kinds of things, let's not be terribly precise. The number that I had there from 2015 was, 27%, whether it's, 27% or 1/3 or something like that. It's somewhere in that ballpark, I think, would be reasonable. as a size. But again, the more important thing is that if you're thinking about, markets, which many businesses are thinking about, you're likely to have a very large number of people now in Pakistan that have the income, discretionary income, to be buying consumer durables of all kinds. White goods for, in the house, transport goods, etc. And that I feel reasonably confident about because the trends in these businesses are so strong. Very quickly on the terrorism thing, it's very clear that terrorists are not coming. People who have a propensity to become radicalized, let me say, are not coming from the very, very poorest segments of society. But most of the research I've seen suggests that there are thresholds. Maybe at some level people might have a propensity to become radicalized, but then as education levels get higher and higher, that propensity tails off again. And so you've got to get over a hump and down the other side, and then you get into more stable areas. And the one thing that is true of the middle class everywhere is that they are much more in favor of stability than they are in favor of, let's revolutionize everything and break up the existing order.
There's a whole conference on this topic, I'm sure. Rihanna, on the choices in women's education, have you got anything to contribute on that?
Well, just generally women's or just generally across all sectors? Yeah, I think, manpower planning as such is out, and I think the government of Pakistan doesn't do that. Most of the higher education institutes, the public sector, and there's a growing private sector, are quite autonomous in how they look at the courses they offer. And I haven't seen any work in Pakistan where there's any kind of matching that's going on in terms of demands for skills and the supply of skills. I think there's a big debate in terms of the mismatch that's happening in terms of quality. There's a lot of people who are getting these higher education qualifications, but then are going into the labor market and taking jobs that are very low productivity. So, you may have someone who has a master's who's applying for a job to be a gardener. So there's clearly an issue about the quality of some of these higher education institutions. So I think there was an article in Dawn recently which talked about, are we educating our middle class too much? Or in some sense there was a concern that they were getting, a lot of people in the middle class were getting an education. It wasn't a very good quality of education. I just wanted to say something about Homi's point on the service sector being the driver. I think the two constraints on that, it's one of the things that we talked about as women and women entering the labor market. I think that's going to be a real issue there. And the other issue, again, going back to the quality of education. There's an educational crisis in Pakistan in terms of quality. I think that's going to be a challenge on that front.
Okay, other questions? We start on this aisle right here. The microphone.
Thank you. I hope you don't mind if I don't stand. My name's Iram. I'm at Georgetown University. I'm a PhD student there. I think this question about how exceptional is Pakistan is a really nice one, right? And I wonder, and I'm kind of doing this in my own work as well, trying to figure out that there are countries in the world where the elite, or at least the upper middle class, seem less bothered about redistribution. And there's a great paper out right now on a randomized experiment in Buenos Aires where they randomly increase the electricity tariffs for part of the wealthy neighborhoods in that city. And then they ask people, does this bother you, right? That these funds are being used to redistribute public goods to low-income people. And they actually found the pocketbook effect was almost not there, right? The more of the resentment was that, is everybody in my wealthy neighborhood paying the same amount as me? So there's really interesting effects that take place when you have a long history of democracy and solidarity and political institutions that give you a sense of linked fate to people who are not of the same income as you, but still are represented in similar ways. What is our history of authoritarianism done to the development of the middle class feeling this sense of linked fate with other Pakistanis? And to what extent will that determine our ability to generate taxes, to have redistribution, or to even put more women, for example, into certain sectors of the economy? Thanks.
That's a really good question. Let me collect a couple of others at the back.
So Thank you for starting what I think is a very interesting debate that is going to go on for a while. I'm Anis Dani. I'm a colleague of several of you on the panel. I was wondering whether I could ask you to do two things. One is to unpack the aggregation. So when you're talking of rural, a big question is the share of rural population that actually has migrated. Has that had any difference? Do you see any different patterns between parts of the country which have phenomenal outmigration versus those which don't, right? Because presumably that should trigger some change. Could be positive, could be negative, but it should trigger some change. Similarly, I mean, this would have been a question for Ali. He talked about the absence of attention or the absence of women's involvement in political parties and the absence of attention to women's issues by these political parties. I try to follow what different parties are doing, and we have seen over the last 20 years some significant differences, and I'll point out two. The MQM and the PTI have a different stance towards women and women's involvement compared to the other parties. And I'm wondering whether Ijaz would want to take a stab at, does the way that political parties engage with men or women make a difference, or is the pattern still the same? And if you don't, you will pass on it. Now, the broader question for me is the one that you were raising at the very beginning, Homi, which is, what difference does it make? Does the growth of the middle class lead to a different compact between citizens and the state? And is there any evidence that those who are in the middle are behaving differently in terms of their willingness to contribute to the state or their willingness to demand better services? And if not, why do we care whether the number is 19 or 27 or 37? So is that happening, or is there too much interference, and is Pakistan a bit of a different case, right?
And I'll take another question right here on the aisle.
Hi, I'm Shahid Yusuf from SAIS. Two comments and a question. The comment is that Homi mentioned that services, we've had a long debate on this together, that services are going to be an important driver of growth in Pakistan. But it's only tradable services that could be a driver of growth and of exports. There is no evidence that Pakistan's tradable services are increasing, because without those, Pakistan will not be able to generate the exports it needs in order to balance its trade and current account and pay China for the BRI loans and so forth.
People.
I'm coming to that. People, secondly, while yes, there will be a pressure in Pakistan to export people, will there be a demand for these people given changes in political factors in various receiving countries, and also automation of many services and manufacturing and construction? The question I have is with regard to the relationship between the middle class and growth. The way I see it is that middle class growth could be a brake on GDP growth, because if they save less, if they invest less, and you can see a decline in gross domestic investment in Pakistan, and you can see a decline in gross domestic savings in Pakistan. If they demand more services but are not willing to pay taxes for those services, if it leads to greater inequality and therefore social tensions, all of those will pull down growth. So though there's an endogeneity here between middle class and growth, and I recognize that, a growing middle class will be a brake on Pakistan's growth. Thank you.
A lot packed into those questions. This issue of the people's sense of spending on public goods that apparently doesn't differ by income. Is that the question largely? Which surprises me given the debate we're having here in the U.S. at the moment. But does anybody have anything to say on that?
Yeah, so on two of these issues. One is the state of public service delivery and the growth of the middle class. So Karachi is the largest, perhaps, urban sort of like, agglomeration in Pakistan, maybe 20 million, though the census numbers are contentious, right? But we'll leave that aside. Karachi's services have deteriorated steadily over the last 10 to 15 years in every respect. I'm talking about sanitation, waste management. You know, what has grown is privately provided services. Schools, private hospitals, those seem to be doing well. But if you look at any aspect of public service delivery, Karachi is astonishingly bad, right? Transport, public transportation. It seems like everybody's just checked out when you look at Karachi. And you really have to ask, the largest growth of the middle class has clearly happened in Karachi, wherever else it may have happened, right? But there seems to be no correlation between that and a clear, cohesive demand for public services that is actually translated into the government doing anything about those services. So that's one issue that I think we need to think about what's going on, right? Even in the last 10 or so years of democratic government, we can say, right? To the second government about to complete its term, Karachi has deteriorated, not improved, right? That's one. The second is, I want to go back to this issue of, and we can continue on this topic. Each of these is an important, really long topic on its own. But I want to touch on two other points which I think are important. Migration and the kind of windfall gains, I would say, we've had in the last 2 decades in particular, really starting with 2001, right, when the migration really took off. I'm not so sure that we can rely on those gains, and I completely agree with Shahid here. They're already falling. So I'm also now working on GCC countries, and I see that there are a lot of people leaving. They're levying new taxes and fees on migrants. They really don't want that. I mean, they're looking ahead. As they look to their future, they want to minimize the number of migrants, and they want to maximize the number of nationals doing these jobs. They have fewer jobs to do, and they would like to give those to, for example, in Saudi Arabia, they just instituted a law that said all Uber drivers have to be Saudi overnight, right? I'm just giving you one instance, but this is happening in every space. So what happens when our migrant worker is no longer needed outside? We don't have any alternatives for them, as far as I can tell, right? And the largest growth, I think, that's actually happened in Pakistan is in tiny informal businesses, right? So they support a little bit of household income, but it's really unclear that these are going to grow into service or other sector businesses that are going to support this growth. So I'm quite worried about having a complacent idea about Pakistan's growth prospects, right? Because there are some really major challenges. The other thing I just want to say before is this whole idea of we don't seem to be worried anymore about the rural economy, right? I've noticed this in all sorts of discourse where everything we're talking about is like, you know, let's think about what's happening to urban growth, let's worry about the urban economy. Huge chunk of people still live in rural areas. Agricultural productivity is dismal, right? And there is very little diversification there. That could be an engine of growth, actually, because Pakistan has enormously good agricultural land, good irrigation, and if agriculture diversified into export goods, there's a huge demand for that in the future. But we're not. We have very low productivity, and we seem to have entirely forgotten that 1/2 of Pakistan's population lives in rural areas, and service delivery there is, I don't want to use, the word dismal is too good to use. The state seems to have checked out. And I have good data to show. I mean, I'm not just saying this. The state literally seems to have checked out of service delivery in rural areas, right? So those are my few thoughts on this.
Before I get to the services sector, Ijaz, the question about the political parties in there. And so a question I had after Ali's talk as well was whether the parties are unattending to potential women's vote that's not coming out of ignorance or out of preference.
Actually, both PTI and MQM are attending to that issue, and you see it in the votes they get. If Ali were with us, he'd be able to say a lot more about it because he has tracked one constituency in Lahore, which could go either way, very closely contested in the last election, 2013 election. And they did a very detailed analysis of which way the vote is likely to go, especially after the whole corruption issue came up And the answer was very interesting. People who were surveyed, they said, yes, corruption is important, and we believe Imran Khan is less corrupt. However, it's not the only issue which will attract our vote. We want to see services being delivered as well. And at least in this constituency, people across gender felt that PMLN was providing more services. Remember, this is a constituency in Lahore. So you have a mixed kind of engagement depending on which constituency we are talking about. I think Sindh's problem is much deeper and structural. You've got a party in power which derives its strength from its rural support, and it runs Karachi in a dismally poor fashion. And we don't know what the solution to that problem is. For as long as the big cities are going to remain captives of the larger provinces in which they're located, this problem is not going to go away. Now, I'm less sanguine about this thing about, we can project 6.5% growth into the future, and about services for me. And I think for precisely the reasons that Chai mentioned. I mean, no economy has had its entire growth strategy built upon remittances. There are just too many unknowns in that for us to be comfortable about projecting high growth just on the basis of remittances. Just one small point, Ghazala, even though you're right, the quality of services being delivered in the rural areas is quite poor, yet your own past work shows that rural poverty has declined, if anything, faster than urban poverty. So there's something going on there so something is working. We don't know exactly what, but something is working. Sure.
So I think that over the last 17 years, poverty has definitely gone down. But we're talking from people coming up from very low levels to above $2 a day, really. That's what we're talking about. And that has been fueled very largely by migration, right? And that is migration to the cities as well as migration outside. And also by a lot of growth of the informal economy. Can those two growth factors push us, right? Further is the question that we're asking, right? So there's no question that Pakistan has not been completely stagnant, right? The question is, and someone asked, I think we didn't really respond to that question, which is Pakistan exceptional? Not at all in the region, right? The whole region looks like this, right? The question is, well, there's been rapid poverty decline across the board in South Asia. We are equivalent, right, to the decline in Bangladesh or other places. We've just been not as cognizant of it, I think, till recently. So I think poverty has declined, but whether that translates into, 6.5% sustained growth, right, over the medium haul is, I think, is what I'm questioning. At least it's not clear what would drive it.
We're running out on time, but I wanted to ask Homi about the question about the services question that came up, but also just to the extent that what we've been describing is almost two Pakistans, rural and urban. And from my simple mind, the idea that inequality increases as the middle class increases. But Homi, you're thinking about this. Maybe you have some thoughts.
So I think that there's now been a lot of discussion about the effect of inequality on growth and the question about the middle class and growth. I think for countries like Pakistan, actually demand is probably a stronger driver of growth than supply. So, having more demand is probably more important than having more supply and more levels of investment. So from that point of view, I don't think that it would be reasonable to think that the middle class will act as a brake on growth. It'll continue to act, at least for a quite a substantial period, as a demand driver of growth. And here I think if one is to think about the ways in which Pakistan differs from other countries, I think there are two really important differences that are happening right now. One is Pakistan is trying to achieve this kind of transformation to a middle-class society without full participation of women. That is very, very rare. In most other places, in particular in East Asia, the growth of the middle class has been associated essentially with two-income households, let's just put it that way, but with actually female participation in the wage-earning labor force that has gone to extremely high levels. So even when we think about the quite low levels of women's labor force participation rate, there are even lower levels of women's participation in wage-earning occupations in Pakistan. This is really, so this is quite a different trajectory from other countries. If it doesn't change, it's unclear that it would really be sustainable. And then the second big difference is that Pakistan is now growing and going on a trajectory where it is not government that is delivering many of the services of the middle class. It's not just the rich people who are opting out, it's the middle class. It is the private sector that is delivering the education services, the health services, and many of the other things that the middle class is demanding. And it's an open question whether that is more effective because it's in some sense it's unpackaged. You pay your tax, which is essentially, let's say, the school fee for a very specific service, education, or this or that, rather than a general tax, which then funds a range of government services which may or may not materialize. One way or another, that's a quite different process with a different compact and a different relationship between the citizen and the state than what we've had in the growth of the middle class in Western economies. But there's no particular reason why that should be either better or worse or different. It's just, it is different. I don't think we've really experienced these kinds of things before because we haven't had the ability of the private sector to deliver these services effectively up until now. And now we have new technologies that do allow that in a completely different way.
And of course, there are some public goods that the private sector is not well suited to deliver, like contract enforcement or property rights.
That's right.
Yeah. Anyway, we have run out of our time. I want to thank you all for coming and thank our, if you can join me in thanking our panel. Ijaz, do you have a point? I'm sorry, hold.
I have a 30-second invitation to all of you to help yourselves to CDPR policy briefs, which are out there at the table, and subscribe to the newsletter. This is a serious effort to create a credible alternative view of what's happening in the economy, alternative to what the government puts out, what the World Bank puts out, and what the bilaterals put out. This is Pakistani scholars who have had the international experience and are working in various research centers and are doing this highly empirical, very solid analytical work. So I invite you to subscribe to the newsletter. Go to our website, cdpr.org.pk, and just see for yourselves what's going on there.
Thank you very much, Ijaz.